welcome. Please take a seat, get cozy, and enjoy a cup of terror. With me, Stefanie Valentine. Hello, my spooky little pumpkins. How are you today? I hope you're doing well. Now, I've got another historical story today. In my second to last video, where I talked about Agnes Waterhouse, I mentioned that there were women before her who were tried and punished due to accusations of witchcraft. We've talked a lot about women being persecuted and accused of witchcraft. Most often, they are ordinary working class women. Today, we have a royal witch, a woman who was married to a rich and powerful medieval royal and was accused of witchcraft in order to bring him down. The story starts in August 1422, when the medieval King Henry V died suddenly. He was only 35 years old. His reign was taken over by his son Henry VI. Henry was still an infant, though, when he became king, so his uncle Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and a few other men governed the country on behalf of Henry until he was old enough to rule on his own. Jacqueline Desnottes, I'm very sorry, I've probably pronounced that completely wrong. She was the wealthy heiress of an impressive amount of land and estate, including several areas of what is now known as the Netherlands. She was a rich and eligible bride. Her uncle arranged a marriage between Jacqueline and one of his relatives, John IV, Duke of Brabant. John turned out to be a pretty awful person and a pretty awful husband, so Jacqueline got an annulment of her marriage and she received safe passage to England from King Henry V in 1421. Henry was very welcoming and she was accepted into court life. She was asked to be godmother to his infant son, the future Henry VI. When Jacqueline put together her household in England, Eleanor Cobham became one of her ladies-in-waiting. Eleanor was born around the year 1400. We don't know her exact date of birth. She was born in Sturborough Castle in Surrey. She was the fourth child of Sir Reginald Cobham and his first wife, Eleanor Culpeper. We don't really know anything about her childhood or her upbringing, but as her family were part of the gentry, it's highly likely that she would have received an education and been taught how to read and write. Humphrey married Jacqueline in 1423, and then in October 1424, along with an army and Jacqueline, he went to Holland to fight and regain control of his wife's estates. Also accompanying them was Eleanor, as a member of Jacqueline's household. At some point in their time on the continent, Eleanor and Humphrey began an affair. Humphrey's attempt to take Jacqueline's estate and land back through force was a failure, and a lot of the locals were supporting his opponent. Humphrey decided to give up, which is fine, except he acted like a big old coward when in April 1421 he deserted his wife and he returned to England with Eleanor as his mistress. Poor Jacqueline was left there on her own, and sadly she lost the battle and had to hand all her land and territories over. That was the last time Humphrey would ever see her. Eleanor and Humphrey's affair was soon public knowledge. The general public, they saw his affair as a disgrace. They weren't happy that he'd abandoned his wife abroad and that he had a mistress. The complaints didn't make a bit of difference to Humphrey, though, as when in January 1428 the Duke's marriage to Jacqueline was annulled, he quickly went on to marry Eleanor. Their marriage was controversial. Eleanor's rank was far below that of the Duke. Marriages for those in the upper class tended to be ones that were beneficial in some way, be that economic, political, or military. Eleanor and Humphrey's union offered no such benefits. They had married for love, which was kind of shocking back then. Eleanor was described as a woman distinguished in her form and beautiful, intelligent, and ambitious. And Humphrey was described as cultured, pleasure-loving, and intelligent. But he was also known to be reckless and impulsive and very opinionated and argumentative within the political community. Anyway, Humphrey and Eleanor seemed to be very well matched. They enjoyed the arts and learning, and at their manor in Greenwich, they would often have artists, writers, and philosophers visiting. King Henry VI really liked them both, and Helena had some power around court. They were a power couple. Things took a pretty dramatic turn, though, in September 1435, when Henry's brother, John, Duke of Bedford, died. Henry VI, who was he was still a teenager at the time, so he was childless. Humphrey was now next in line to the throne, and because the king was still a child, essentially, Humphrey became sole Lord Protector, which meant that he was basically in charge of the country until Henry became old enough to rule. It meant that Eleanor's position in court was also elevated. In November 1435, Humphrey placed his whole estate in a jointure with Eleanor, which was a significant move. It meant that she was able to enjoy all his properties for life, and if she were to outlive Henry, she would inherit everything, all his estates and his wealth, and in turn this meant that she was now one of the wealthiest women in England. 6 months later, in April 1436, Eleanor was given the title of Duchess. Up until the early 1440s, she seemingly had everything. She was at the height of her power, and she knew it. She would regularly flaunt her wealth and her position by riding through the streets of London, all dressed up in her finery, escorted by various noblemen. She was influential in court, and she also had some influence over the young king. Eleanor had many interests, and one of them was astrology. Unfortunately, though, her interest in astrology would be her downfall. Eleanor had started turning her thoughts to the possibility of her husband inheriting the throne after King Henry VI. She became quite obsessed with the idea of Humphrey one day becoming King of England. Ooh. In 1440, she consulted astrologers to try and gain insight into whether her husband would ever become king. Interestingly, astrology wasn't seen as unusual at that time. It was perfectly acceptable to practice astrology, and many of the nobility would employ astrologers to advise them on various things. Eleanor consulted with well-respected men. One of the men was Roger Bolingbroke, who was principal of St Andrew's Hall in Oxford. She also consulted with Thomas Southwell, her personal physician. Both practiced astrology and were well respected within the community and within the field. The horoscopes they produced made a dangerous prediction, though, that Henry VI would suffer a life-threatening illness in the summer of 1441. Unfortunately, these predictions soon spread across London and reached the king and his people. In predicting serious illness and possibly death for the king, it was seen as the astrologers potentially wishing the king dead, which was seen as a treasonable act at the time. Henry thought Eleanor was using some sort of sorcery to plot his death. He commissioned another horoscope, and the court used their own astrologers, and they couldn't see any illness or death in their readings, which helped to put Henry's mind at ease. Although part of me thinks that even if they did see something alarming in their readings, would they say anything? They saw what was happening to Roger and to Thomas. I highly doubt they'd want to suffer the same fate. And they seemed concerned with reassuring and comforting the king. part of me thinks they would only give the king good news. At the end of June, they questioned Roger, Thomas and John Home, Eleanor's chaplain. Roger Bolingbroke revealed that Eleanor was the one who had organised everything, that she had instigated it all, and she'd commissioned them to read the horoscopes. The three men were accused of conspiring to bring about the king's death. Sometime between July the 10th and July the 12th, the men were arrested on charges of treasonable necromancy and heretical practices. Roger was also accused of contacting demons and other evil spirits. Eleanor saw what was happening, and before she could be arrested, she fled to Westminster and attempted to claim sanctuary. Because there were charges of heresy, it was down to the church to determine innocence or guilt. Those who were being accused of treason or use of witchcraft couldn't have the protection of the church, so sanctuary could not be given to Eleanor. On the 24th of July 1441, Eleanor was questioned by a panel of bishops on a list of 18 charges. They were all related to treasonable necromancy through acts of witchcraft and heresy. She denied most of the charges, but she did admit to 5 of them. Unfortunately, the exact details of the charges she confessed to have not survived. On the 11th of August, she was sent to Leeds Castle, which confusingly is in Kent, to await her trial. Now, witchcraft wasn't necessarily considered a crime at the time. As long as nobody was harmed, the courts would kind of turn a blind eye to it all, and they would look the other way. Harmful acts of witchcraft, though, would be considered heresy, and the church would investigate. Whilst Eleanor denied most of the charges put forward, she did confess to obtaining potions from Margery Jourdemayne, also known as the Witch of Eye. Not much is known about Margery's family or her upbringing. She was married to William Jourdemayne, who was a cowherd. He came from a fairly prosperous Middlesex yeoman family. Strangely, for a wife of a farm labourer from the early 1430s, Margery seems to have kept the company of quite a number of respected and important people and courtiers. It's likely that many of the women of the court knew of Margery's skills and services, and many probably consulted her. She was even consulted by the second Duke of Somerset about his fate in impending battles, and advised him and told him what to do. It seems that Eleanor had been using Margery's services for quite some time, at least 10-ish years. Eleanor really wanted to bear a son and heir for Humphrey, and she admitted to seeking out Margery's help in becoming pregnant. Some claimed that Eleanor employed Margery to make drinks and medicines to encourage the Duke to love her and to wed her. It seems that Margery had already been imprisoned for witchcraft. She was held prisoner at Windsor Castle for a period of time. In 1432, she was released on condition of good behaviour and that she refrained from further witchcraft. Spoiler, she obviously didn't keep to the conditions of her release. We know that she continued to use her skills and her services, offering potions and charms and spells to various clients. Roger Bolingbroke and Thomas Southwell, they were formally charged with sorcery, felony and treason, with Eleanor as an accessory. On the 19th of October, Eleanor returned to Westminster. She asked for the case to continue in the church courts, and a hearing was held on the 21st of October. She was judged by various religious men, including the bishops of London, Lincoln and Norwich. Once again, she denied most of the charges, including the charge of conspiring the king's death. And again, she did admit to getting potions from Margery, She just wanted help conceiving and producing an heir, which is why she sought out the kind of services that Margery offered. 2 days later, on the 23rd of October 1442, there was a second hearing. Roger, Thomas and Margery all appeared at the hearing, and they all accused Eleanor of being the causer and the doer of all these deeds. The verdicts were given. Eleanor, Roger, Thomas and Margery were all found guilty. Unfortunately, it didn't end well for any of them. Thomas Southwell died on the 26th of October whilst imprisoned in the Tower of London. It has been suggested that he might have died taking poison in order to escape the death of a traitor. The next day, Margery Jourdemayne, who had been found guilty of heresy and witchcraft, was burned at the stake at Smithfield. Roger Bolingbroke was hanged, drawn and quartered on the 19th of November. John Home, Eleanor's chaplain, who had been arrested along with the others, he was given a royal pardon for confessing to witnessing the witchcraft, and he was set free. Eleanor renounced her heresies and witchcraft. She was spared execution, but she was forced to do public penance. She was ordered to walk barefoot to 3 London churches on 3 market days in November, holding a candle which she would then offer at the high altar in each of the churches. She was instructed to walk with a meek and demure countenance. Market days were chosen because they were very busy, and they wanted Eleanor to be seen by as many people as possible. The humiliating punishment she had to endure made quite a lot of the citizens in London feel sorry for her, actually. She was also forced to divorce the Duke and stripped of all her titles, all of her wealth and her influence. The courts were kind of unsure how to proceed with Eleanor. She was found guilty of using witchcraft, but there wasn't a mandatory death penalty for the crime. She was also a duchess. There was no precedent for dealing with a woman of her rank in that sort of situation. They eventually decided on life imprisonment. She was imprisoned at Chester Castle, first of all. She was given an allowance of 100 marks a year to live on, which I worked out to be around £42,000 in today's money. Not bad for a prisoner. She was also allowed a few servants. But I guess for the Duchess, who was used to living a life of real luxury and power for many years, I suppose that would be a very different sort of lifestyle that she was used to. She may have been spared her life, but the whole ordeal would have been incredibly humiliating for her. She remained at Chester Castle for a year and a half. In October 1443, she was moved to Kenilworth Castle. In July 1446, Eleanor was moved to the Isle of Man, and finally in March 1449, moved to Beaumaris Castle in Anglesey, where she died on the 7th of July 1452. As for her husband, his previous desertion of his wife makes you think that he's not really the type to kind of stick his neck out for anyone else. Apparently, though, there were indications that he did try to make some attempts to save Eleanor. Unfortunately, he was losing favour in court, and he'd been having disagreements with the king's other advisors, so there wasn't really much that he could do. Humphrey was noticeably depressed after his separation from Eleanor. He'd lost favour with his nephew, the king, and Eleanor's trial and imprisonment destroyed all of his political influence. 6 years after Eleanor's conviction, there was a plot to overthrow Humphrey as Duke of Gloucester. In February 1447, he was arrested on charges of treason, probably a false made-up charge. He was already suffering badly with depression, so the arrest did not help. He refused to move or communicate for 3 days. On the 23rd of February 1447, he was found dead in his lodgings. It was probably likely due to a stroke, but there are rumours that he was murdered. It's a shame what happened. I guess it was a bit foolish of Eleanor to seek predictions about her husband inheriting the throne, as it would have been seen as wishing the king dead, as the only way that she and Humphrey's kind of position could be improved would be at the expense of the king. Her and Humphrey's enemies were able to use that as proof of her wishing the king's death, and then it didn't help that Margery was involved. She was already a convicted witch, but maybe Eleanor was just curious about her future. I would be. I want to know. Eleanor dabbled in the black arts, which might have raised a few eyebrows. She purchased potions and maybe cast a few spells, but at the time it was very common for people of all classes to practice a little bit of witchcraft. This was just before the witch hunt mania that gripped Europe, and like I said, some people might have been like, no, but it was kind of accepted within society, or at the very least people would just kind of look the other way. It's probably more likely that Humphrey's enemies wanted to bring him down, and they knew that Eleanor had power and influence herself. Personally, I think that her downfall was planned in order to take down her powerful husband. There isn't enough historical documentation to really prove what happened. We'll never really know Eleanor's true motives. We'll never really know if there really was a conspiracy to bring down Humphrey and Eleanor. I think the accusations were exaggerated, and that her and her friends' use of astrology was just a convenient way of bringing down the couple through accusations of witchcraft. It's mad to think, though, that this all happened in the space of under 20 years. Eleanor was a minor member of the gentry, and then she becomes a lady-in-waiting to a wealthy woman, and then she goes on to marry that woman's husband. She marries Duke, she becomes a duchess, and she even becomes a potential future queen. She had loads of money and power, and then suffers this horrendous fall from grace. Her fall was as quick as her rise. Sometimes I think it would have been fun to have been a member of the nobility and the elite back then, but then you remember all the backstabbing and jealousy and power plays, and then I just think like, maybe not. Too much drama for me. Margery's execution and Eleanor's exile were not legal sentences at the time, as even though witchcraft was mentioned and the use of it was one of the charges, the crime of witchcraft would not be officially recognised for quite a while longer. Predicting the death of the king was treason, though, punishable by death. So, as I mentioned in my video about Agnes Waterhouse, whilst, yes, she was technically and legally the first witch executed in England, there were others who'd been executed because of witchcraft, but it was linked to charges of treason and heresy. So, that is the story of Eleanor Cobham, the royal witch. She was a strong, ambitious young woman. She grew to be very powerful, and it's easy to see why her enemies might have wanted to see her fall. So thank you for hanging out with me today. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and join me next time for another Cup of Terror.